Histobiograph.
She held it high like a crown. And in that moment, they didn't smell a scandal. They smelled salvation. History, my friends, has never been this fragrant. When we talk about queens who changed the world, we usually talk about crowns, swords, and blood. But this queen? She changed the world with something far more unsettling. A smell, a vow, and a silver rosary soaked in sweat. Not a vow of silence, not a vow of poverty, a vow to not change her underwear. Not for a week, not for a season, for nearly a decade. And she sealed that vow with something small, something sacred, a rosary, silver, stained, gripped in her fist so tightly, the beads left marks in her palm, and the stench lingered in the cord. It was 1482. Granada still stood, the last jewel of Islamic Spain. And Queen Isabella of Castile had just declared war, not only against the Moors, but against her own body. I'm Chris, and this is Crimes of the Crown. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to Histobiograph 365. We don't just tell history. We resurrect what they tried to rot and erase. So, did Isabella really wear the same linen undergarments through 10 years of war? Almost certainly not. But the story endures because it reveals a truth far filthier than fabric. Behind the myth is a woman, one who weaponized devotion, who turned pain into politics, who clutched a rosary crusted in battlefield grime and whispered prayers so fervent they reeked. Some say she made the vow before her army. Others claim it was whispered in private to her confessor. All agree on one thing. Her fingers never left that silver rosary. As Christ suffered without comfort, she is said to have whispered, "So shall I suffer, until his victory is made flesh." To her troops, it was a holy gesture. To her priests, proof of sainthood. To her ladies-in-waiting, it was a slowly festering nightmare. And to her enemies, a sign that Spain would be unified not through treaties, but through blood, smoke, and a woman who stank of righteousness. But before we gag on this legend, we need to go back. Because to understand how a vow like this became possible or believable, you must first understand the world Isabella was born into. 15th century Spain wasn't a nation. It was a continent of chaos. Kingdoms fought, faiths clashed, borders bled. Christians, Muslims, Jews, all vying for control under the shadow of centuries-old wars. And in that turbulence, a girl named Isabella was born. Not an heir, not a threat, just a spare daughter, tucked away like a piece on someone else's chessboard. Her father died when she was 3. Her half-brother ruled like a ghost. Whispers called him Henry the Impotent, for reasons both political and personal. No one expected much from the girl with no crown. Then war broke out over who should rule. And suddenly, the quiet girl became the center of Spain's bloodiest question. They tried to marry her off, to foreign princes, to kill her claim. But Isabella had something sharper than a sword: silence, strategy, and a plan of her own. At 18, she made her move. A secret marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, not for love, but for control. 2 crowns would become one, and Isabella would never again play anyone else's game. From that moment on, she didn't just wear a crown. She wore a weapon, and around her wrist, always, the silver rosary. It clinked as she walked. It stank as she prayed. And it marked every city that burned under her name. But here's the real question. What kind of world believes holiness smells like rot? That sanctity is proven through filth? Because this isn't just about a woman who didn't change her clothes. It's about an empire built on the illusion of divine discomfort. And that little rosary? It will follow us through this story, through battles, executions, betrayals, until its final prayer burns in ash. In the next chapter, we trace the origins of the vow, the medical superstitions of the time, and the rising stench of righteousness that turned a queen into a legend and a biological hazard. Before she became a queen soaked in sanctity and sweat, Isabella was simply the girl no one wanted. Born in 1451, tucked into the forgotten halls of Madrigal, she wasn't a daughter of glory, but a spare, a bargaining chip with good manners and no crown. Her father, King John II of Castile, died when she was 3. Her mother slipped into grief and madness. Her half-brother, Henry IV, inherited the throne and chaos. Henry's court was filled with factions. Noble families feuded over land, power, and bloodlines. And in the shadows of that broken kingdom stood Isabella, quietly watching. She wasn't supposed to matter, but that's what made her dangerous. While others played politics with armies, she played with silence. She watched who lied, who flattered, who betrayed. She learned how power moved, not through titles, but through timing. And around her wrist, always, that same silver rosary, passed down from her mother. Cold to the touch, warm when pressed into prayer. Even as a girl, she never let go of it. To the court, she was just another noble girl waiting to be married off. But Isabella had already made her first vow. Not the vow of filth. A deeper one. She would never be used. While Henry squandered the throne on lavish hunts and impotent diplomacy, the kingdom fractured. Rumors swirled that his daughter, Joanna, was illegitimate, that she was born not of a king, but of a courtier. The scandal set Castile on fire. Nobles wanted a new heir. They looked to Isabella, but only as a puppet. Marriage offers poured in. A Portuguese prince, a French cousin, even the aging king of Aragon. Every deal came with one condition: surrender. She said no, again and again, politely, then firmly, then absolutely. They threatened her, tried to isolate her, cut off her allowance, pressured her mother. She held the rosary tighter. At 18, she made her first strike. A secret meeting with Prince Ferdinand of Aragon, her cousin, her equal, her co-strategist. No permission, no blessing, just a plan. Their marriage changed everything. Not because of love, because it was a merger. Two crowns, one alliance, and a future that no longer needed Henry's name. It was the first time Isabella turned faith into fire. The marriage sparked a civil war. Henry named another heir. But the people, and the church, saw something else. A queen in the making, crowned by resistance, not inheritance. In 1474, Henry died, and Isabella claimed the throne, not with blood, but with will. As rivals plotted coups, she was already organizing tax reform and military restructuring. She didn't sit back. She marched forward. And at every public appearance, one item remained constant. Not a crown, not a sword, that silver rosary. In paintings, it dangles from her fingers like a commandment. In private, it absorbed the sweat of every decision she couldn't undo. It became something else, a tether between prayer and war. Because Isabella didn't want power. She needed it to protect what she believed was divine order and to erase anything that threatened it. This is where the smell begins. Not in the vow, but in the purpose. Because when the Reconquista resumed, it wasn't about borders anymore. It was about souls. And the queen who once swore she'd never be used would now wield everything. Her body, her fear, her faith, like weapons. Even if it meant wearing that rosary. Through dust, blood, and 10 years of unwashed righteousness. In the next part, we follow the march toward Granada, and the moment Isabella made the vow that would rot both myth and memory. By the 1480s, Isabella was no longer a queen in training. She was a crusader in velvet and steel. The Reconquista had dragged on for centuries, a slow, brutal chess match between Christian kings and Muslim emirs. But to Isabella, it wasn't a game anymore. It was prophecy. The last remaining Muslim kingdom, Granada, glittered in the mountains like a final insult. Its minarets, its libraries, its fountains whispered everything Isabella swore to silence. She didn't just want victory. She wanted purification. Not just territory reclaimed, but memory, language, and even smell. And this is where her infamous vow begins. According to chroniclers decades later, Isabella summoned her court before the first campaign. Her soldiers stood in rows, her confessors at her side, her rosary in hand. And she said something no one expected. Not a speech of conquest, not a call for glory, but a vow of discomfort. As Christ walked without relief, so shall I walk. I will not remove this garment, not until Granada bows before God. Her hand gripped the silver rosary, now dulled by constant friction. The beads were warm, slick, stained. It was a gesture of piety and power. Because no general could complain of hardship now. The queen had raised the stakes, not by strategy, but by stench. This wasn't a vow of symbolism. It was operational. Granada's campaign would take years. The terrain was mountainous, the defenders ruthless, the weather blistering, and the queen was everywhere. She didn't stay in palaces. She lived in military camps, slept on canvas, ate field rations, coordinated supply chains with a parchment in one hand and that rosary in the other. Soldiers began to murmur, at first out of admiration, then unease, not just at her resolve, but at her presence. There were rumors that the air around her tent was thicker, that servants began falling ill, that even the horses refused to camp near her quarters. Her physicians suggested rest, a bath, a change of linen. She refused. To do so would be to break the vow and, in her mind, lose God's favor. Because Isabella didn't see filth, she saw faith made visible, pain that could be counted, sweat as sacrifice, and the rosary, no longer clean, no longer ornamental, had become something else. A tether between heaven and the trenches, the thread between conquest and contagion. Some claimed she wore the same dress underneath her armor. Others that she had multiple identical layers, never changed, only reinforced. All agree, she refused to be clean until Granada fell. It was no longer strategy. It was ritual, and the smell became a symbol. There were soldiers who claimed to fight harder just to end the vow. Others wrote to their wives that the queen's devotion fills the camp with incense and infection. By 1485, towns began to fall: Ronda, Loya, Valles Malaga. Each victory added not just territory, but tension. Because as the Christian noose tightened around Granada, the queen's presence became unbearable. Not politically, physically. Many twist. Some courtiers drew lots to avoid serving her tent. Not for fear of her wrath, but her rot. Still, she remained. Still she prayed. Still the rosary never left her hand. There are letters, half legible, likely censored, that describe a strange procession in the royal camp. A young pageboy collapsed after entering her quarters. A surgeon refused to return, but the queen endured, because she believed that suffering purchased sanctity, that conquest required cost, that God would not grant Granada to a comfortable court. And behind her, always, that silver rosary, now blackened, sticky, and whispered about like a relic of divine decay. In the next part, Granada's walls begin to crack, and so does Isabella's body. But her vow remains unbroken, even as her court begins to rot. By 1486, the queen's presence had become unavoidable and unbearable. Isabella's vow, once admired, was now feared, not just by her enemies, but by her own court. The smell clung to everything: her tent, her robes, her rosary. It seeped into the air like a second skin. Not violent, not sudden, just slow, suffocating saturation. What began as a symbol of devotion was now a quiet terror, and the people closest to her began to rot from within. Servants whispered of the breath of the queen, a phrase that meant not reverence, but risk. Some began rotating shifts to minimize exposure. Others abandoned camp altogether. A mid-ranking steward was found unconscious near her supply table. A scribe developed ulcers across his hands after handling her linens. The royal physician submitted 3 requests to intervene diplomatically for the sake of health. All denied, because Isabella didn't see decay. She saw proof. If her suffering infected others, it was a sign of shared burden. If the air around her burned the lungs, it meant God was testing their faith, not her hygiene. And that rosary, once polished silver, now looked like rusted chainmail. It left smudges on everything she touched. It rattled when she prayed. It reeked when she slept. Her confessor allegedly asked, once in private, "Your Grace, how long can you carry this?" She answered, "Until no part of Spain smells of the unbeliever." The war outside the camp was progressing. Granada was shrinking. Town after town fell under Christian banners. But inside Isabella's war tent, another siege was unfolding. The court itself began to unravel. Messages to Rome were delayed. Horses died mysteriously in proximity to the queen's quarters. A cook reportedly went mad after being ordered to prepare a fresh robe for Her Majesty, and was later found scrubbing his hands raw in the river. One of the queen's own ladies-in-waiting collapsed after 3 nights sleeping beside her. In her fever, she screamed of saints choking on dust. She died weeks later, and still, Isabella remained. Some historians argue that this was exaggeration, that these symptoms were common in camps, that medieval hygiene was universally poor. But then why, in dozens of unrelated letters, do we find the same phrase repeated? The queen suffers in silence, and so do we. To question the vow was to question the war. To suggest illness was to invite heresy. Even Ferdinand, practical, battle-hardened, is said to have relocated his quarters further from hers after 1487. Because this wasn't just a military campaign anymore. It was spiritual combustion. And Isabella believed, truly, that her vow, her smell, her presence was part of God's plan. That the more she withstood, the faster the gates of Granada would crack. But something was changing beneath her silence. She began to lose weight. Her eyes grew sunken. The rosary, once clutched in prayer, began to hang lower, dragging against her waist as if it were pulling her down. And yet, the vow held. One friar recorded, "She prays with fire, but breathes like ash." Another wrote, "She has become both temple and tomb." No one dared say it, but all wondered, was the queen dying by her own vow? In the next part, the gates of Granada open, but what comes out is not only surrender. It's something far more human and horrifying. January 2nd, 1492. After 10 years of war, 30,000 lives lost, and a vow that clung to skin like rust, Granada finally fell. At dawn, the gates creaked open. The last Nasrid ruler, Boabdil, known as the Moorish Little King, emerged in silence. His face pale, his sword reversed, his pride swallowed. He did not kneel to Ferdinand. He knelt to Isabella. Wrapped in a ceremonial robe, flanked by her court, the queen received the keys to the Alhambra, a symbol of victory, of purification, of prophecy fulfilled. But no one could ignore the smell. Witnesses described the moment as sacred. Others wrote of an overwhelming heaviness in the air. Not just grief, not just incense, something deeper and older. Because Isabella had kept her vow, she had not changed her undergarments in nearly a decade. Not during the sieges, not during the sickness, not even on the day her kingdom was born anew. The rosary still hung at her side, blackened, stiff, soaked in triumph and rot. According to one chronicler, her tent was stripped immediately after the ceremony. The garments she removed were not cleaned. They were burned, not as shame, but as relic. Some claimed the smell lingered long after, that the ashes were buried with holy salt, that the servants who handled them became sick within days. Others say the garments were displayed, briefly, as proof of divine endurance, then quickly hidden, as if their power had begun to corrode even faith. What had started as a gesture of devotion had become something else, a relic of obsession, a sacred curse. But while the court lit candles and choked on relief, Isabella was already planning the next purification. Because 1492 wasn't just the end of Granada, it was the beginning of expulsion. Weeks after the surrender, the Alhambra decree was signed. All Jews in Spain, tens of thousands, were ordered to convert or leave. Centuries of culture, learning, and coexistence swept out in 4 months. The same year, Isabella funded Columbus, sending ships west to find riches and new souls to sanctify. The empire was coming, but it smelled of old cloth. For all the pageantry, Isabella herself collapsed days later. She was carried from the camp, not dead, but visibly weakened. The vow had broken, but it had taken something with it. Ferdinand refused to speak of the vow publicly. He focused on treaties, infrastructure, colonization. Isabella, however, commissioned a small chapel, built near the burned site of her war tent. Inside, a single silver rosary was sealed into the altar. There is no plaque, no record, only a faint marking on a military map from 1493, labeled Sancti Dolores, Chapel of Sacred Suffering. Because even as the empire rose, the queen who birthed it was unraveling. In the next and final part, we follow the aftermath, Isabella's fading years, the rewriting of her myth, and why her smell still lingers in history's breath. Isabella returned to Castile as a saint. That was the narrative her court crafted, a holy queen who had delivered Spain, purified it, and paid for it with her own body. But behind the hymns and portraits, her health was failing. She walked slower, slept longer, ate less. Her rosary, the same one she had gripped through 10 years of sweat and siege, now hung above her bed like a warning. She rarely spoke of the vow. When she did, it was only to her confessor. One chronicler claimed she once whispered, "I was clean in God's eyes, even if not in theirs." What does that mean? Did she regret it? Or was she still clinging to the idea that the body must rot so the soul might rise? What we do know is this. Isabella spent her final years rewriting herself. She commissioned new paintings, her robes white, untouched, her face serene, her hands immaculate. Not a trace of grime, not a wrinkle of war. The woman who had ruled from a battlefield tent, who had turned her skin into a shrine of sacrifice, was being washed from the record. Many twist, When her body was exhumed decades later, some reported a lingering scent in the tomb. Mold, perhaps, or sanctity, but the smell was real. And so was the silence that followed. Her daughters were told only the holy version. Her legacy became catechism. She was beatified in art, if not by the church. And the vow? Vanished from official histories. It returned in whispers. Protestants mocked it in pamphlets. Poets in England wrote that the Catholic queen stank heresy to death. In France, a comedy was staged where a noblewoman purifies herself by sitting beside a bundle of Isabella's undergarments. Centuries later, Oviedo and others wrote the myth back into ink. Some claimed she wore the same shift for 10 years. Others said she had 7 identical garments and never washed any. No one agrees, except on the core idea. The vow became a symbol, not just of religious extremism, but of the burden women carried to prove power. Because for Isabella, pain wasn't the price of rule. It was the proof of rule. Even now, Spain cannot decide what to do with her. To some, she is a hero, the mother of a unified nation, a visionary, a saint. To others, she is the architect of persecution, expulsion, and conquest. The woman who turned piety into policy and prayer into purification. But the vow remains. Whether true or twisted, it reveals more than the chronicles ever could. Because every empire is built on myth. And every myth begins with something someone tried to cover up. So maybe the most terrifying thing isn't that Isabella wore the same linen for 10 years, but that history tried so hard to launder it and failed.